This is Rummy's Corner. Good evening, boxing fans, and welcome back to part 4 of the top 10 by decade scoring experiment. In part 1, we started with the heavyweight division, next came the cruiserweight division, and last time out we looked at the light heavyweight division. Today in part 4, it's the super middleweight division, where we will once again be utilizing Ring Magazine's rich archive of historical rankings in order to try and objectively determine the top 10 super middleweight boxers from each decade. Ring Magazine began doing annual rankings for the super middleweight division back in 1989. So for our purposes here, we're going to start with the first full decade with a complete data set of rankings. The 1990s. At the conclusion of 1990, these were the top-rated super middleweights according to Ring Magazine. Tommy Hearns was the first name on the list, so he will receive 10 points. Next on the list is Christoph Chiozzo, and he gets 9 points. We continue allocating points in this fashion until we get to the 10th name on the list, Dario Walter Mattione, and he receives 1 point. There happen to be 10 names on this list, but sometimes Ring has 11 names in their rankings. For our purposes here, we're only going to be concerned with the top 10 names listed. If we go through and do this for every year from 1990 through 1999, our final results would look like this. Frankie Lyles finished first with 53 points, stemming from the fact he was considered a top 10 super middleweight throughout most of the 90s. Then there's not a whole lot separating Nunn, Ben, and Eubank. Then we have Roy Jones in 5th place, where he was considered the best at the weight class over a 3-year period. A lot of people believe that, in a head-to-head hypothetical sense, that Roy Jones Jr. is the greatest boxer to have ever officially competed in the 168-pound weight class. But for our purposes here, under our scoring criteria, we're looking for guys who were consistently considered among the very best in a single weight class over a specific decade, in this case the 90s. And Jones simply didn't compete in the weight class long enough for him to place higher. Moving on to the double O's, it was an impressive showing for Joe Calzaghe, who tallied 78 points. Calzaghe was viewed as one of the very best for 8 consecutive years, and had he not decided to move up to light heavyweight during his last year as a professional prize fighter, he may have wound up with an even higher score. Strong finish for Kessler with 53 points, and he came on strong in the middle of the decade here. Then you have guys like Mundine, Aki, and Ute. They were all well regarded. But when I think of this decade, the 2 super middleweights that jump to mind for me are Calzaghe and Kessler. Calzaghe defeated Kessler in their big divisional showdown a couple of years before the Super 6 started, and Joe was clearly the dominant force in the division during the 2000s. And now, even though the current decade is not yet complete, through the end of 2017, the list looks like this. Andre Ward is on top with 50 points, and he was the man in the division throughout the Super 6 and beyond. And you see there's a handful of competitors from the Super 6 that are on this list, and not surprisingly, Froch is currently second with a respectable 42 points. And mathematically, Groves and DeGaulle could still surpass Ward before the decade is over. So we'll have to wait and see how the next 2 years play out before anything can be finalized here. Looking at the most dominant decades for a super middleweight since 1990, we have this. Calzaghe tops the list with 78 points in the double O's. Then we have a tie between 90s Frankie Lyles and Mikkel Kessler from the double O's. Next is Andre Ward from the current decade, Anthony Mundine from the 2000s, and then Carl Froch and George Groves from the current decade, Michael Nunn from the 90s, Sven Oetke from the 2000s, they're tied for 8th, and closing out the list we have Nigel Benn from the 90s. In total, there were 4 super middleweights who qualified as a top 10 for multiple decades. We have Joe Calzaghe and Charles Brewer from the 90s and the Double O's, and then we have Lucien Bute and Mikkel Kessler from the Double O's in the current decade. And if we add up all the numbers from the super middleweights who finished in the top 10 during the 3 decades we covered, our final results look like this. Joe Calzaghe, not surprisingly, finishes first, and he has a comfortable lead with 103 points. All 4 of the guys who appeared in multiple decades made the final list, and given the short history of the division and the small sampling size we've had to work with, I think it's a pretty decent list. Roy Jones Jr. not making the final tally is definitely something that probably doesn't sit well with a lot of people, but again, Roy didn't compete as a super middleweight for a particularly long time. And this scoring system, it doesn't account for head-to-head outcomes or hypothetical speculation. It's simply about being considered among the best in a single weight class during a specific decade. And based on that, I think Joe Calzaghe ranking first makes perfect sense. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Please stay tuned for part 5 of the Top 10 by Decade series, where next we'll be taking a look at the middleweight division. Until then, have a great night.